Welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today's episode, I want to look at why JSON is so successful nowadays, why by far the most APIs are using JSON, why JSON won over XML. That's the main topic of what I want to talk today. And I want to talk about three different things there. First, I want to talk a little bit about the history of XML, why it was even created and why it was chosen to be the foundation for the first wave of web services, of APIs that were provided over the web. The second thing I want to talk about is a little bit about what XML actually is. So why it was designed the way it is and why that is a little different from what you actually are looking for most API scenarios. And the third thing I want to talk about is to talk about what JSON is and why it is in many ways a better fit, but specifically why one of the differences of JSON versus XML is such an important thing, I believe, for why JSON succeeded pretty quickly, actually. And it's really something I like as a discussion, as pondering over these things, thinking about why do these things happen. And it's also something where I have spent a lot of time with. I spent a lot of time with XML when it was popular. I spent a lot of time teaching people XML when JSON didn't even exist. And I also saw how JSON took over. So it's something where I have a lot of experience, and I still think that there's this one big underlying explanation that is more important than other possible explanations. But I'm sure that people disagree, and that's fine. I just want to tell this one story that I think is interesting. So let's start with the history of XML. Why was XML even around, so to speak, and why was it chosen for the first wave of APIs of web services that were provided over HTTP, over the Hypertext Transfer Protocol? The explanation there is pretty simple, so to speak. XML was standardized in 1998. It was standardized by the W3C, by the World Wide Web Consortium. So it was kind of naturally part of this ecosystem of webby things. And back then, the idea was that looking at the web and the huge popularity that it had, that people started thinking about, well, if it's so important and so useful for having people talking to machines, why don't we have machines talking to machines? So there was kind of a natural thought there. And then the next logical question was, okay, if we want to have machines talking to machines, we need to be able to exchange structured data. That's kind of the heart of every API. You have structured data that needs to go from whoever produces it to whoever consumes it, and there needs to be a way how the structured data is represented, how it is sent over the wire, so to speak. Back then, when you were looking at the options, there actually weren't that many great options. There were some structured data formats around. Maybe the most important one back then was called ASN1, the Abstract Syntax Notation 1. But that was a very heavyweight standard. It was created by ISO. It was used in kind of slightly obscure environments, so people weren't really sure that this was a good choice. And back then, XML, again standardized in 1998, had just become something that the W3C thought was important. It was developed for a slightly different purpose. We'll get to that in a minute. But it was, and that's the most important part looking back in history here, it was the most promising candidate for a simple to understand and openly standardized format that you could use for structured data. And that was the main reason why it was chosen as the foundation for this first wave of web services, which we call APIs today. Now let's go into the second part of my story. The second part of the story is, what was XML actually designed for? And that is where it gets interesting. XML was not designed as a way to represent structured data. It was designed as a way to represent structured documents, and that is a difference. When you look at documents, a document is, when it's a simple document, it's just text. It's just a string of characters. But most documents nowadays, and documents on the web, generally speaking, are structured documents. So they have things in it such as paragraph, lists, highlighted text, embedded links. So it's not just a series of characters, but it's this mix of characters and then these structuring mechanisms such as lists and paragraphs that then allow to interpret the text in a structured way. And XML was created as a way to represent any kind of structured document on the web. That was the design goal of XML. That is why the W3C did it. And this is what XML is really good at, representing structured documents. And what's interesting when you look at a structured document is, it is, in technical terms, it's a tree. It's an ordered tree, but let's mostly focus on the fact that it's a tree, meaning that the data structure is something that you can picture as there's a document and then there's, let's say, paragraphs that are nodes that are underneath the document. So these are child nodes, and then the paragraphs may have text in them and they can have additional things such as highlighted text or links, and maybe between the paragraphs there's a list and the list has list items and so forth. So as you can see, it's a data structure that is always comprised of one node and then subsequent nodes or child nodes. And for some reason, computer science trees always are upside down. So if you just flip it around, you'll get an actual tree. So this is what XML was really made for, representing documents in that tree abstraction. Now, when the first web services standards were looking at XML, they said, well, it's meant for documents, but it surely also can represent data. And that's true. Structured data, to some extent, you could say, is just a special case of a document. It's actually easier to represent structured data than representing structured documents, because these typically are more irregular and they have a more complex model of what a document can contain and how it can be structured. So what they did is they used XML for representing structured data, which is fine. But the result of that was that now when you were programming with these XML-based APIs, you had to program in a way that you get the XML document, and then the XML document gets parsed in memory into this tree, and then you have to extract data from that tree. You have to get to your individual data elements in that tree structure. And that was always a rather, let's say, painful or at least complicated process, because you had to use this tree thing and reach to the right places and get your data out of it. And quickly there were standards around it. The most important one is called the document object model, DOM. And DOM is useful. It's a general model of how you represent those trees and how you gain access to all the parts of the trees, to elements and attributes and children and all the stuff that's in there. We won't go into any details. But it is something you need to learn. So the DOM is a specific model of how XML is represented as a tree. And if you want to use XML data or you want to produce XML data, you always have to make this mental mapping between the DOM model and then whatever you're programming with, which are some kind of objects. And that was the painful thing for people to go through all the time, to have to go from this tree model to the object model they were programming in their regular programming language. And it was very interesting to me. Back in the mid-2000s, I was teaching at a university, and as a part of that, we also taught, we looked at XML, we looked at XML programming with XSLT, we looked at XML databases with XQuery, and you could tell that everything was okay. It was just a different world to learn programming in, but it also always was a little alien to people who had a good background in programming, but not in trees and documents and XML. And that's because this tree world is just a little different. It's a different kind of data structure. And this is where we get to the third part of my story, which is JSON. JSON came around as a simpler way to represent structured data. And when you look at JSON, the interesting part, I think, really to start with is that it was not even defined, so to speak. It was just taking a programming language, in this case JavaScript, and then just taking the object model of this programming language and turning that into a data format. And that is exactly what JSON is. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So it's nothing but the data part, so to speak, of a programming language, of JavaScript. The big advantage of this was that it immediately removed the necessity to deal with trees, with XML, with data binding, as it was called back then. Having this rather complicated process of taking your objects, representing them as a tree, and then on the other end, taking the tree and turning that into objects again. So all of this just went away because you said, well, let's just exchange objects instead of trees. And I think, and this is where I'm coming to the close of my argument, I think this is really why JSON was so successful, because for most applications in the API space, it's just a much better match to what people are working with. In most cases, people are working with programming languages that have some kind of objects or structs or structured data types or whatever the programming language you're working with calls these things. But typically, they are pretty close to what JSON can do. And that makes it easy for you to consume JSON and to produce JSON, because you don't have to go through this mental mismatch of trees versus objects. And I think this really is the main reason why XML was fading out of the popularity curve in APIs pretty quickly, because JSON was just such a better conceptual match. And what we see nowadays is that most APIs use JSON. There are some other things such as Protobuf, the data model for gRPC created by Google. This one is also enjoying some popularity, but XML is basically out in that space now. But it's still around. It's being used for documents, it's being used for structured documents, it's being used in databases, it's being used in publishing pipelines where you are writing books or articles or all these kind of things. So it's back, so to speak, to where it was originally planned to be used, which is this space of being used for structured documents, and this slight hype curve, so to speak, in the API space where JSON then ended that popularity. There was just, so to speak, a little strange and unforeseen usage that XML enjoyed, because somebody at that point just needed some way to represent structured data, and XML seemed to be the best thing around. I think that's actually a pretty interesting and entertaining lesson in how sometimes, in particular, of course, when you look back, I guess, there are all these interesting just paths of how history had developed, where people were standing, what they wanted to do, what was around, what they were choosing as a result, and then what developed as a result of that not being so great. And I think really looking back, it's sometimes interesting to just think of how tech history, so to speak, evolves over time. So I hope you found that interesting. Leave your thoughts in a comment if you have your own thoughts around why JSON is so popular nowadays and XML kind of disappeared. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you like my content, please subscribe, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.